Hello and welcome to our very first virtual lesson on your journey through GCSE. Now, we need to begin with getting your book filled out. Okay, so if you're sitting there with the book, please fill it out. You can see here on the screen in front of you. Fill it out as follows, please, with your name. You are now studying GCSE history, and we're going to begin with option B1, which is the code that the exam board give to Anglo-Saxon and Norman England. Now, my name is Mr. Johnston, but you may have a different history teacher, so feel free to write their name in as well. Okay, you'll also see the learning intentions, or basically what we're going to be learning today in the blue box, and usually a little starter activity for you to get on with. Usually used in the classroom, but if we're working from home, it could just be a little brain teaser to start off with. So today's lesson is how was Anglo-Saxon England organised? So we're going to begin by introducing ourselves to the course that you are studying, Anglo-Saxon and Norman England. We're going to be looking at what England was like back then, who was at the top, who was at the bottom, and then we'll be looking at our King Edward, sometimes known as Edward the Confessor, and to what extent he was a weak king. Okay, now when you've filled out the front of your book, be sure to write down the title in your book. How was Anglo-Saxon England organised? And make sure that you underline your title, just like I have. Okay, now this is the GCSE that you will be studying with me. We are going to begin, as you can see, with paper 2.1. The reason why I've said point 1 and point 2 is because paper 2 is divided up into two sections. The first half is the Anglo-Saxon and Norman England, and the second part of it, down the very bottom there, is the American West. Okay, so you get 3 questions on each. The other 2 papers, paper 1 is a thematic study that is on medicine in this country from the Middle Ages all the way through to today, with a little section on medicine during the First World War. And then we're going to finish the year off with an excellent study of Weimar and Nazi Germany. So basically, Germany after the First World War, all the way through to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Okay? Now, today, I would like to just get the ball rolling by starting off with Anglo-Saxon England. And when you're ready, let us begin. So, what we're looking at here is, of course, England, but not the England that you would know of. Okay, now Scotland, of course, as you can see on this map, was a separate kingdom ruled by King Macbeth. Yes, that is the same Macbeth in the Shakespeare play. He had ruled Scotland since about 1040. Wales, as you can see, was made up of smaller, separate kingdoms. And by about the 1050s, those Welsh kingdoms had been kind of unified, except in the south. And as you can see, England itself was divided up into lots of different areas. Now, we're going to be talking about them in a minute, but for the purpose of the beginning, we can say that each of these areas that you can see, for example, that area in the north led by Siward, or that big area in the south led by Godwin, these are known as earldoms, okay? And they are, at one point, they would have been kingdoms, but by the time that we're studying, the 11th century, they were just earldoms. So they were all in the one kingdom, but they were ruled by an earl, and they had been given their position by the King of England. So each of those earls that you can see, those are names, by the way, Siward, Leofric, Bjorn, and etc., etc. They were all given their job by the King of England. Okay, and as you can see, the largest, Northumbria, at the very top, led by Earl Siward, and some of the more powerful ones were the one in the very south, led by Earl Godwin. That is Wessex, and you've got other ones like Mercia and East Anglia. Okay, now today I would like to look at how this kingdom was organized. They had a very, very clever social system or hierarchy that kind of allowed the kingdom to run very, very smoothly. Okay, now the king at this time, at the very top of our social system, the King of England at this time, was this man here, Edward, sometimes known as Saint Edward or Edward the Confessor, but in his lifetime he was known as King Edward. Okay, now quite an interesting man, King Edward. He was the seventh son of a king called King Ethelred II, and he didn't actually grow up in England. He spent most of his childhood growing up in Normandy, over in the north of France, because when he was 10 years old, his family were forced to leave England because the Vikings invaded England and took over it. Okay, so Edward grew up in what we call exile, which means he grew up away from his homeland over in Normandy. Okay, and by about the year 1042, through a very, very complicated story, the King of England, a Viking called Harthacnut, died without an heir. There was a little bit of a kerfuffle over who was going to become the next king, and eventually, the throne of England passed to Edward the Confessor, who came back and was crowned in 1043 as King of England. He was actually crowned in Winchester Cathedral, and his coronation marked the end of Viking England and the beginning of Anglo-Saxon, or the return, should I say, of Anglo-Saxon England. Now, before we look at whether he was a good king or whether he was a strong king or a weak king, we need to understand the social system of Anglo-Saxon England, okay? Now, at the very top, you had the king, as you can see here, okay? And this is what we call a hierarchy. Sometimes it is organized in a pyramid, but for this diagram, I've just put it as in a ladder type shape. So a hierarchy is just a posh word for, it means a system that's arranged in a clear order of rank of status. So for example, the more important people are at the top of this system and the less important people are at the bottom. Okay, so everyone in this system knew their status, they knew what was expected of them. Okay, now a person's status could actually increase in this system if they paid for it. So at the very bottom, you had peasants, for example. Well, peasants could actually become thanes. I mean, highly unlikely, but it could sometimes happen. Or peasants could become churls, which are slightly different types of peasant who can actually move farm to farm. So this system, thanes, for example, could become earls. Earls could challenge the king. Peasants could sell themselves into slavery. So this system was a very, very mobile system. People could kind of move up and move down depending on their circumstances. Okay, so as you can see at the very top, you have the king. Okay, now his role was really to protect his people from attack. In fact, if we just flick back a little bit, we can see these are the duties of a good king. So he was meant to defend the country against invasion. So for example, during this time period, it would have been the Vikings that were always kind of raiding England. So he had to defend his country and his people from attack, usually by commanding the army himself. So a king would have to have some sort of military skill or some sort of experience in the battlefield. Not always, not essential, but a very important skill to have. Secondly, they had to ensure that they passed really good and fair laws. In fact, history is littered with examples of kings being punished for not passing fair laws. The king also had to make sure that everyone obeyed his laws, and justice had to be passed if some people didn't follow the law. We will cover, of course, the legal system in a future lesson. He also had to have a very good relationship with the church. Of course, in the 11th century, the church was so important. Obviously, the church were responsible for crowning a monarch. A monarch was seen as a kind of representative of God himself on earth, and it was up to the king to make sure that the church was not only kept intact, but well run and well organized. So the king, for example, could choose who the Archbishop of Canterbury was, who the Archbishop of York was, But again, we will examine the church in Anglo-Saxon England in a future lesson. Finally, he had to, a bit like a teacher, I suppose, had to manage the people under his command. He had to manage his earls and his other nobles so that they cooperated with his decisions and helped him run the country effectively. Okay, so the king appointed earls and other important people. He gave them their title. He could take it away from them, but he had to get these people on side because in this system, his earls could potentially challenge him. Okay, again, this just comes down to who is the king. Some kings were stronger than other kings. Some kings allowed their earls to kind of have more freedom. Other kings controlled their earls very strictly. But that was, of course, a very important role for a king. Now, a king is just one man. He cannot rule the kingdom alone. And thankfully for our monarch, in this case Edward the Confessor, he had a very interesting support network to help him run his country. And it is known as the King's Royal Court. So you may read extracts or you may watch some films and it talks about the King's Court. It's not talking about a courtroom, with a judge or anything like that. The King's Royal Court is made up of three bits. It's not one. It's not a building. It's actually just a collection of people. And the three bits of it are the Witan, the King's household, and the King's administrators. All three of these make up collectively the Royal Court. The Witan was a group of wise men. Okay, it actually comes from the Saxon word which means a meeting of wise men. The king chose who could sit on the Witan. It was often earls and bishops. The archbishops of York and Canterbury were in there as well. It was made up of exclusively very important people. Okay, and they never had one specific place where they would meet. The king would decide where they met, when they met. The king would listen to the advice that the Witan provided him, but the king didn't have to listen to this advice. He could choose to reject it. He could choose to accept it. But the Witan was extremely important because by consulting the most powerful men in the country, a monarch could show that he respected their views and that they were more likely that would probably allow them increase the chances of them supporting his decisions. But by far the most important role of the Witan was in choosing and crowning a new monarch, and that is going to become very important when we study the succession crisis in 1066. So it was up to the Witan. Whenever a king died, the Witan would choose the next king, and it wasn't always as simple as the king's son. But we, of course, will look at that a little bit later on. The second part of the King's Royal Court was the household, made up of basically his family, his wife, maybe his sons, his housecarls as well. His housecarls, of course, being his soldiers, a bit like knights. Although you didn't have knights in Saxon England, they were known as housecarls. And we will study housecarls a little bit later in this course because we'll be looking at the army very soon. So if you're interested in that, tune back in. Servants also would make up the royal household, but I don't imagine servants would be advising the king on anything. The third part of the royal court was the administrators. These were usually men within the church, and they helped the king with the day-to-day paperwork of being a king. So they physically wrote all the king's laws, any letters that the kings would want to send to people. The administrators would write it and ensure that it was delivered to the people that it was meant for. These are known as writs. So a writ is like an official document from the monarch, usually containing a law. They usually look like scrolls. And it would be the administrators that would write these up and ensure that they got to the people that they were meant to get to. And the administrators would travel around the country with the king wherever he went. Okay, so if the king travelled around the country, his administrators would come with him. So these three parts, these three groups of people, they all make up what is known as the king's royal court. So Edward, and every other monarch, they have always had the support of these networks to ensure that the kingdom is run efficiently. Okay. Now, the next group of people in our hierarchy or in our social system were the earls, okay? So the earls were by far the most powerful lords in England, and they owned large, huge areas of land known as an earldom, which we mentioned earlier. And you can click back if you would like the PowerPoint to look at that map again. There were usually roughly no more than 6 earls. Sometimes it could be a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, depending on the time period that you're looking at. But under Edward, maybe about 6 earls, okay? And they had a lot of power, similar powers to what a king had. So, for example, in their earldom, they would collect tax, and they often took a cut of that. So these earls were extremely wealthy. They were meant to use that money to ensure that their earldom was well defended. The earl would also have to ensure that the king's laws were implemented across his land. The earl would have to raise an army for the king from all the people within his earldom. They would have to be a very loyal supporter of the king, and depending on who was king of England, these earls could have more or less power. For example, when William the Conqueror becomes king, he takes a lot of power away from these earls, whereas Edward allowed his earls to have quite a lot of influence over him. Okay. Next, we have the Thanes. They're about less than 1% of the population. They are nobles, which means they hold land. They have a title. They are still quite important men. But they're not as powerful as earls, okay? Roughly by about 1060, there was 4,000 of these people, these men in England, okay? They were warriors primarily who defended the kingdom. So when the earl had to raise an army, it would be the Thanes that would fight in that army, alongside, of course, the peasants. But we will look at them. We'll look at the peasant army a little bit later on in the course. Thanes would have land as well, not as much land as an earl, but they would have a large estate given to them by their earl. In that estate, they would have a large manor house, usually with their own private church. Thanes were very important to earls because it was the Thanes that went round and ensured that tax was collected, roads were repaired, bridges were built, walls were repaired, and things like that. So the Thanes were very important in making sure that the earldom ran the way it did. So you would have one earl, but within an earldom you might have quite a lot of Thanes. They would also run the courts, but we will look at courts a little bit later on, okay? And at the very bottom of our social system, unsurprisingly, are the peasants. Now, peasants made up roughly about 70% of the population. They were farmers mostly, so they worked on the land of their lord from their thane. They didn't own that land, they rented it from their lord. And they also had to work on their lord's land for 3 days a week as well. Okay, they lived off the things that they grew or the things that they made, so they were very self-sufficient. If they had anything extra, they would have to pass that on to their lord, or they could take it to market where they could trade. But we'll be looking at markets and towns next lesson. So if you're excited about the economy, come back next lesson. They were usually tied to their land, which means peasants couldn't move from farm to farm. If they worked on one lord's farm, that was them. They had to work on that farm. There were actually other types of peasants called churls. I've not actually put them in this diagram, but they would be probably between a peasant and a thane. A churl was just, again, it was a free peasant. So they were still farmers, and they did the same work as peasants, but they could actually move along from farm to farm, or they might actually own their own farmstead. Okay, and as I've said, down the bottom you can see a peasant would have to provide food, taxes, and they would have to fight in the army for 40 days every year. But again, we will study the army later on in the year. Okay, so this is our hierarchy, and as you can see, the full thing is reciprocal, which means everybody has to give someone something and they get something in return. Okay, and down the side you can see who gives each other what and who receives what from everyone. And this is basically how Edward the Confessor's system worked. Okay. Sorry, that was my notes bumping off my coffee table. Okay, so we're going to pause there. So our very first task in your book, okay, is to use the information that we have just gone through. Now you should have access to the PowerPoint. Um, if you don't, of course, you can pause this video and rewind and have a little look at it. But our task for today, our first task anyway, nice and easy to break us into this topic, is in your book you are going to draw a blank diagram. You're going to draw a diagram of the hierarchy, a bit like this one, although it might not have as many lines as that. And you're going to slot in, number one, really easy, going to slot in where these people would be: Earl, Thane, Churl, Peasant, and King, okay? Now, once you've done that, for each of them, you are going to explain what their role was, what power did they have. You could even go down the sides like I did and explain with little arrows who gave each other what, okay? And make sure this is as detailed as possible, because you'll be coming back to this when we get to 1066, because we'll be trying to look at how much William the Conqueror changed England. So you'll be having to refer back to this. So make sure it is as detailed as possible, okay? Now, you're more than welcome to pause this video whilst you do that task, because I'm now going to move on to the next part of the lesson. So pause, have a go, and I'll tune back in with you in, say, 15, 20 minutes. Off you go. Okay, now, so your hierarchy should look something like that, although you may have drawn it as a pyramid. Hopefully it's just as detailed as mine. So what kind of things you should have? What are the bare bones of this social system? So king, remember, he was meant to protect people, he was meant to pass laws. He controlled, for example, the circulation of silver pennies. You could even write down, although I haven't mentioned it in mine, that he had his royal court, which was made up of the Witan and his royal household and his administrators. He would grant titles and land to people, he would take it off them. He had the power to raise an army. He had the power over the church. So, for example, he would appoint the archbishops of Canterbury and York. So again, if you haven't got any of them, feel free to go and add it in. So he would give, down the side, he would give an earldom to an earl. He relied on his earls, because without his earls, he was absolutely powerless. He could not go and fight an enemy if he did not have his earls by his side, okay? Earls, of course, most important lords in the kingdom. They held a large area of land known as an earldom. There was about 6 of these earls in England. They were often competing with each other over who could be the most powerful. By far the most powerful one was the Earl of Wessex, which at this point was a man called Godwin, who we're going to look at today, actually. Just after this, we're going to look at Godwin. The earls oversaw the courts. Earls had to raise an army. Earls had elite bodyguards known as housecarls, which were a bit like knights. The king would have them as well. They would have to pass tax on to the king. They would have to be a loyal subject to the king. But they could challenge the king, okay? Thanes, about 4,000 of them in England, warriors. They held smaller amounts of land from their lord, usually an earl. Thanes would fight in the army, but they would also... They're a bit like knights, Thanes. They're like knights, but knights is a kind of Norman French thing. The English version is a thane. They would live in a large manor house. They would collect tax. They would have to use that money to improve the defences of their area. They would also run the courts as well. And at the very bottom, you have the peasants. You may have added in churls before. Churls, of course, being free men who owned small areas of farmland. They did not have to work for their lord every week. And they, of course, had to fight in the army. And at the very bottom, the peasants. 70% of England, they were farmers. They could be evicted from their land if they didn't actually work on it. They couldn't move from farm to farm. They were mostly kind of self-sufficient, so they would grow their own food and make their own clothes. Some of them would go to markets to trade with, but again, we will look at markets next lesson. I think it's next lesson. Okay, so if we're ready, we can now move on, okay? So I thought what we could do just before we wrap this lesson up is we could have a little look at Edward himself, okay? Now, attached to this lesson, there should be a lovely little series of notes all about King Edward the Confessor and what type of king he was. And what we're going to do is we're going to read those notes. You should be reading them just after this. And in your book, you are going to do the following. You are going to draw a table to show both examples of Edward being a kind of a good king, an effective king, a strong king, and evidence of him being a weak king. Okay. And at the very end, you can, of course, on a blank map of England, annotate where the earldoms were, who ruled over them, and where this area known as the Danelaw was. Okay, now all of this information is going to be in those notes. It can't all be me spoon feeding you today. You're going to have to do a little bit of reading. Okay, so we're going to go and do that. That should take you roughly about 15 minutes, maybe, to do. About 2 pages of notes. You're going to sit and you're going to read it, and then you're going to do those tasks in your book. Okay, and again, I'll check back in with you in 15 minutes, and we'll go through the answers. Go. Okay, so we've had roughly about 15 minutes. Off the top of my head here, Edward being an effective king. Well, he grew up in Normandy in exile, and when he came to England, lots of people kind of questioned whether or not he could effectively run the country. So one of the good things about him as a king is he managed to get the earls on side. He got Godwin on side, and he got some of the other ones on side, usually by political marriages. That was an example of being an effective king. He also took a really keen interest in the church in England. He appointed the archbishops of York and Canterbury. For example, in his later career, he began the construction of Westminster Abbey. He spent a great deal of time, obviously, praying, which was very important for a king. He kind of stood up to Earl Godwin in the 1050s, so you should have that in. He kind of teamed up with some of the other earls to exile Godwin and his family. Again, that shows that is Edward being an effective king. Also, Edward was an extremely good politician. He kept England relatively peaceful during his reign. So, for example, blood feuds were dealt with. Blood feuds being arguments between families. He kind of controlled them by introducing a new law called a wergild. But again, we'll look at this later on in the course. Trade was very good under Edward the Confessor. So England traded very well. It was a very prosperous country, and a lot of peace with Scotland, and there was a little bit of raiding on the Welsh border, but not much. So potentially an effective king. However, Edward is often portrayed as a bit of a pushover, a bit of a weak king, and hopefully you've found some examples of that. He allowed the Godwins to become far too powerful, by appointing Godwin as Earl of Wessex, his eldest son Svein, for example, one of his other sons, Harold. He married the daughter of Godwin, so the Godwins had a lot of control over Edward. In fact, if you read the little bit on Edward standing up to Godwin, he kind of caves in. Godwin comes back with an army the next year. Because the Earls of England don't want a civil war, they don't back Edward, and Edward has to humiliatingly give in to Godwin and return all of his land and titles to him. He also has to appoint the Archbishop of, it's either York or Canterbury, off the top of my head, I cannot remember that one. He is forced to appoint one of the archbishops that Godwin wants, not who Edward wants, in the church within England. So perhaps Edward was a little bit of a pushover because his earls were effectively forcing his hand on matters like that. Okay, you may of course have far more information than me. I would love to sit and talk to you all day about history, but time is of the essence. Okay, right. The last one should be your blank map of England. So you should have labelled the earldoms led by Siward, Leofric, Godwin, Harold, Ralph, and Bjorn. The Danelaw, of course, being the large portion of the north into the Midlands of England, which were a traditional kind of Anglo-Danish area. So it was the people who lived there were descended from the Vikings who had first kind of settled in England a century or less than a century before. The Danelaw had some very odd customs that were different from the rest of England. So it had different words, like a wapentake, which was a specific area of land. The Danelaw didn't pay certain taxes that the rest of England paid. its customs were kind of based on Viking customs, and the Danelaw was known as an area that was quite difficult to control. Um, so you should have shaded that and then make sure around the Danelaw you actually explain what it was. And if you've done it correctly, you'll notice that basically quite a lot of England was controlled by the Godwin family as well. So you had Harold in the kind of southeast. You had Godwin, obviously down in Wessex, and you'll obviously have the other ones like what's his name? I've actually forgotten his name. Christ, Svein, in there as well. Okay. Right. So just before we wrap this lesson up for today, we could probably have a little think of, depending on your target, of course. You might not know your target grade. If you do, feel free to have a go at those little kind of extension tasks. To what extent did King Edward of England sacrifice some of his power to ensure Godwin's loyalty? Well, he kind of had to do that, didn't he? Because if he didn't get Godwin's loyalty, he wouldn't really be able to run England. He was a reasonably new king. He had grown up in exile. There were still many people in England that argued that the throne of England should have actually passed to Magnus, the King of Norway, not Edward the Confessor. So he kind of had to get Godwin on side, didn't he, by kind of marrying his daughter and allowing him to keep all his land and titles. But by doing so, he kind of allowed Godwins and the Earls to run the show. Was that a sacrifice that he should have made? Probably. Again, depends on your opinion on that one, but you can argue it till you're blue in the face. Right, 4s and 5s. Anglo-Saxon monarchs, like Edward, did not have as much power as they thought. Do you agree with this? 100%. That's just my opinion, though. Definitely, Anglo-Saxon monarchs did not have as much power as they thought. They relied entirely on their earls. Without their earls, they couldn't really do anything. A prime example of this is, in the 1050s when Godwin came back with an army and Edward was powerless to do anything because the other earls didn't support him. And the fact that earls could challenge their monarch basically proves this to be true. In fact, that's something that William, the Duke of Normandy, when he becomes King of England in 1066, that's something that he's going to want to change. Earls should not be challenging their monarch, according to William. So yeah, definitely, I agree with that. You might not agree with it, but totally up to you. Right, 2s and 3s. Based on today's lesson, would you say that Edward of England, was a powerful monarch? Again, I don't want to sway your opinion on this one. You can, of course, have your own one. In my opinion, I don't think he was that powerful. But, again, you can disagree with me on that. Yes, England was quite affluent and very well run under him, but who was really running the show? Who was really running the show? Was it Edward or was it Godwin? In my opinion, it was Godwin, but you, of course, have your own different opinion. Okay? And that basically ends our lesson for today. Okay, so to go right back to the start of the lesson, we set out to describe how the hierarchy works. That social system with the king at the top and the peasants at the bottom. And then we looked at to what extent King Edward was a weak monarch, and hopefully you've come to your own decision on that. Okay? Now, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've come away from it, learned a lot. Next lesson, we are going to be progressing to begin looking at the local government. So we're going to be looking at things like towns and villages, as well as the legal system. So what would they do with naughty Saxons that didn't follow the law? Okay, so tune back in next lesson for some more Anglo-Saxon and Norman England.